Hello and welcome to Holding Space for Democracy, a conversation with Professor Anand Pandian, co-hosted by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, and Hopkins at Home. I'm Mary Bruce, Assistant Director of Public Programs at the SNF Agora Institute, and I am so glad to be with all of you here today. In ancient Athens, the Agora served as a central gathering place for the city's residents. They met to exchange ideas, debate policies, and shape public life. It supported conversation, contestation, and collective action. The SNF Agora Institute builds on that idea of the ancient agora to create academic, civic, and institutional spaces where people come for open dialogue, active debate, and collaborative efforts to address public problems. Together, we strive to strengthen democracy through these efforts. So thank you for joining us today to create a virtual agora, bringing that tradition of the ancient agora into the present. To that end, we actively invite all of you to share comments and questions in the chat throughout the talk, and we'll also have some Q&A at the end of the talk. Johns Hopkins is committed to the steadfast protection of free expression, which emerges from the university's time-honored role in the creation of knowledge and the exploration of ideas. And we've shared more in the chat about our commitment to free expression. And I'd love now to invite those tuning in today from across the country to share in the chat where you're tuning in from, what perspectives you're bringing, and any questions you might have for the speakers. And I will, for our distinguished speaker, and I'll give a moment for you all to chime in on that. And as we do, I'll share that the SNF Agora Institute celebrated democracy and free expression in a big way just 2 weeks ago with our 5th annual Elijah Cummings Democracy and Freedom Festival. We brought together more than 20 experts on different aspects of democracy for a day of reflection and learning, all centered around the theme, making space for democracy. And I've shared more about that in the event chat. And we're thrilled to continue that conversation today with Johns Hopkins University professor Anand Pandian, the Krieger Eisenhower Professor of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins, and author of the new book, Something Between Us, The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. The book is described as an anthropologist's quest to understand the deep social and political divides in American society and the everyday strategies that can overcome them. It is a groundbreaking and ultimately hopeful exploration of the ruptures in our social fabric and the courageous efforts to rebuild collective life beyond them. The professor also serves as the president of the Society for Cultural Anthropology and as a curator of the Ecological Design Collective, a community for radical ecological imagination and collaboration. I'm very excited about this talk. I have been for weeks, and that's not only because I was an anthropology undergrad, but because this is such a timely and prescient book. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Pandian.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that really thoughtful and kind introduction. And thanks to everyone at Hopkins at Home and at the SNF Agora Institute for the chance to join you all virtually. And thanks to everyone who is out there listening live or perhaps later via recording. I really appreciate your interest in this particular project of mine. The book is called Something Between Us, The Everyday Walls of American Life and How to Take Them Down. It grows out of a journey that I took as an anthropologist across the United States over these last 8 years or so, trying to make sense of how we got to the deep social and political impasses that we experience so much on a daily basis here in the country, how to make sense of why things sometimes feel as stuck as they do, and what kinds of strategies might be effective in moving us in a different direction in our communities, in our neighborhoods, and more collectively as a nation. Really appreciate the chance to talk about the book in the context of this larger theme that the Agora Institute has put forward with regard to making space for democracy. It's embodied in the kind of space that the new institute will be holding on our campus, as well as the virtual public spaces and virtual public spheres of the kind that we're all participating in today by means of this webinar. So I'm really grateful for the chance to contribute to the ongoing dialogue sustained by this particular community. This book grew out of a deep sense of unease that I felt myself in the fall of 2016 as an anthropologist, as a citizen of the United States, as someone who spent nearly all of my life here, also as a parent of children of minority background, and in all these different ways, just felt myself with a series of questions about where we were headed as a country and the extent to which our country can continue to be a place open to people of different kinds, people of different backgrounds, experiences, and stories of different kinds, of the kinds that so many people bring to this country from other parts of the world. I was motivated in particular by the promise of then presidential candidate Donald Trump to build a continuous and impenetrable wall between the United States and Mexico. I wanted to understand the appeal of that promise, why it incited so much passion and sometimes even joy on the part of the supporters of his successful presidential campaign, but also how we might weigh that against the real sense of suffering and the feeling of indifference to that suffering that so many people also felt that phenomena like border walls represent. We think about the hardship and deprivation that might lead someone to come into a country like ours without papers, without the formal right to be here. So I wanted to make sense of how we'd gotten to this point. I wanted to understand that as an anthropologist. As an anthropologist, our task is to make sense of everyday life in particular societies, particular cultures, by paying attention to what people do, what motivates them, how they live, their patterns and habits of life, how they think about others, how they imagine what a good life is, and how all these things are embodied in the minutia of their daily lives. And one thing I came to understand very early on when I began this research is that if one wants to make sense of phenomena like border walls, one has to pay attention to the cultural life of more everyday walls, barriers, and boundaries that people live with in their ordinary lives. And so the journey that this book represents took me to over a dozen states around the country, beginning in late 2016 and continuing through last year. Trips in which I met hundreds of different Americans positioned in different places and different ways in our society, and led me to think in particular about four everyday forms of boundary making, line drawing, everyday borders and divisions that I think have a lot to do and a lot to tell us about the divisive nature of our national politics. I'm thinking, one, about the spaces of our homes and neighborhoods, the way that they've become increasingly fortified and isolated, and all the different security measures that have interceded in our relationships with others and our imagination of those who live beyond the bounds of our lives. This is an image from a gated community in Central Florida, where I spent some time for this research. I'm also interested in the walls we carry with us when we're on the go, the walls of our vehicles, our increasingly large trucks and SUVs, massive conveyances that are the primary way in which we get around in the world as Americans, and what kind of impact that has, once again, on our imagination of our lives in the company of others when we are surrounded by these increasingly imposing steel cocoons. I think about the walls of the body, if you will, the way in which so many Americans have come to imagine their own bodies, their own physical embodied selves as fortresses that need to be protected from the threats of others. I'm interested in promises of this kind that our own Under Armour in Baltimore makes. Protect this house, referring not to the home as a physical space, but instead the house of the body. How do we make sense of slogans like that? What's the relationship between those different scales of being and space? I'm also interested, lastly, in what I call the walls of the mind, the media infrastructures, the information ecosystems, the social media channels, all of which function, again, as silos and bunkers that really do stand between us and make it prevalent so often for each of us to live perhaps physically side by side and yet find ourselves in completely different realities, completely different senses of what the world actually is, what it needs, what we in fact need or owe each other as different members of a society. So those are the large scale coordinates of the book. And to give you more of a sense of what's at stake in the book, and in particular, what's at stake in the book with regard to this theme for today, this theme of holding space for democracy and thinking through the importance of particular spaces in common as the foundation of a common life that we might share, as the foundation of a common sense that we might also share as the foundation for a more meaningful dialogue and interchange that we could have. I want to actually just stop and read a few excerpts from the book that would give you a more tangible sense of what I'm up to with this particular project, which, as I hope you'll see, is written not purely for an academic audience. It's written not purely for scholars like myself, but instead with a wider public audience in mind, with an eye to stories and encounters of different kinds that I hope bring these arguments forward in a more vivid manner, and I hope also serve to, in some ways, take down or at least loosen up the walls and divides that separate our own academic spaces from the rest of our national and public life, which is, again, I think, a challenge that we need to take more seriously. So I'm going to begin by just reading one excerpt from the introduction to the book that I hope will give you a better sense of this journey that I've been on. My own parents emigrated to the United States from India in 1972. And my siblings and I were born and raised in this country. We spent a lot of time in India as children, but the United States was home, even if there was somewhere else in the world where we also belonged. As with so many other immigrant families here, however, this basic faith of ours was shaken in 2016, when the question of whether we truly belonged snapped into sharper focus than at any other moment in my lifetime. Again and again, people we knew, even my own father, were accosted with that taunt: go back to your own country. The idea of the border wall was a magnet for such expressions of a harsh nativist politics, and I felt compelled to grapple with its appeal as an anthropologist, but also as an Indian American with children of my own. I began to think about this book project on the morning of November 9th in 2016. Like so many others, I was thrown by the outcome of the presidential election held the previous day. I could count on one hand the number of people I knew who had voted for Trump. Most people I knew seemed somewhat crushed and numb with disbelief that day and in the days that followed. What President Obama said in his farewell address in Chicago a couple of months later was as true of me as anyone else. For too many of us, he said, it's become safer to retreat into our own bubbles, whether in our neighborhoods or on our college campuses or places of worship, or especially our social media feeds, surrounded by people who look like us and share the same political outlook and never challenge our assumptions. And by the way, if you see me looking in a different direction, it's because I have the book in my hands and I'm reading these passages from the physical volume itself. So please do forgive the darting of my eyes in different directions. I had to acknowledge that even as an anthropologist, I knew very little about this country where I was born and raised, where I lived and worked. I began to strike up conversations with people I might pass but never stop to talk with. Others sitting at nearby cafe tables, staff on my university campus, clerks at local stores. A few weeks after the election results became clear, I attended a victory rally for Trump in Hershey, Pennsylvania, a charged and unsettling experience. And over the months and years that followed, I traveled to many places in the United States where I'd never been, trying to make sense of a circumstance I found deeply troubling, but completely opaque. I was far from alone in doing such things. Sitting one night over a plate of fried rice at a Chinese-American diner in Rock Springs, Wyoming, which you see pictured here, I caught glimpses of a Fox News segment about another East Coast professor with a research agenda similar to mine. The chyrons across the bottom of the screen seemed to revel in this tide of newfound liberal attention, with glosses like Professor to Study the Mystery of Trump Voters, and Elites Struggle to Make Sense of Trump Victory. The truck driver sitting further down the counter scoffed, making it clear that he wasn't impressed. There ain't no mystery to Trump voters, he blurted out, talking back to the pundits on the screen. Just getting tired of being pushed around and shit on. I did agree with what that truck driver said, but everything seemed to conspire to make any possibility of mutual understanding between us laughable, even problematic. Such narratives of legitimate grievance and rightful vengeance were rife, and I wanted to find a way to write against them. But to do this effectively as an ethnographer, I had to take seriously the chance of connection, even sympathy, in highly fraught circumstances. I had to entertain the possibility of what James Baldwin recalled feeling among other Americans abroad, even those bent on denying the only kin they have for reasons of race and prejudice. These are my countrymen, and I do care about them. And even if I didn't, there is something between us, Baldwin movingly observed in his 1965 debate with William F. Buckley at Cambridge University. That profound phrase, something between us, evokes possible relationships as well as the barriers that can make them impossible. Such is the texture of this book and the idea that has shaped its title. I rely in this book on stories and travels across the United States, vivid and challenging encounters with salesmen and truck drivers, police officers and urban planners, activists for social and environmental justice. Over the last 8 years, I've wandered into trade shows for home builders and medical suppliers. I've talked to organizers for migrant rights at rallies before the national Capitol, and to white nationalists at a White Lives Matter rally in Tennessee. I visited GMC dealerships in Los Angeles and a truck festival in Iowa, a bottled water convention in Texas, and small towns in the Hudson River Valley reeling from water pollution. I attended a glitzy libertarian festival in Las Vegas, and in Georgia, I pursued intense discussions with one of the country's leading conservative cartoonists. I've logged many thousands of miles on local highways and country roads, striking up conversations with strangers on park benches and in derelict shopping malls. This investigation of everyday walls has demanded openness, often vulnerability, from an Indian American domestic traveler. But I've come to see that people are far more complicated than they may seem at a distance. And I want to pause for a moment with just that notion that, in fact, when you get to know people, you might find that their commitments don't quite line up with what we would expect of them. Their ideas don't always fall into neat ideological categories. Their sense of who they are and their place in the world can carry all kinds of contradictions, which may make it a little confusing to try to make sense of, but it also tells us that social life has more of an openness to it than we might otherwise think, that there are, in fact, possible openings in our collective politics that ensue from the real complexity of people's lived experience. And that's what I try to take seriously as an anthropologist. So I want to do a couple things here. I want to share a couple more fragments from the book as a way of getting deeper into this story and giving you more of a sense of how I bring together these travels and tell this larger narrative about the effect of these everyday walls on our social and political life in this country and what we might ultimately do to try to move beyond these kinds of divisions. So I'm going to skip ahead now to a chapter that is set in the city of Fargo, North Dakota, where I'm looking at patterns of suburbanization and the way in which people have continued to move farther and farther apart from each other and what that does to the texture of social life on the everyday scale of neighborhoods and local communities. The development of the suburb as a residential form involved turning inward as much as spreading outward. Andrea Vesentini argues in his book, Indoor America. Suburbs rejected the porosity of the city, he argues, proposing the family home as a bulwark against the many threats of the world beyond, its uncertainty and discomforts. New ways of organizing interior space in the suburbs, Vesentini shows, focus domestic space away from the life of the street, neighborhood, and community in pursuit of an ideal of introversion and containment. Interiors were devised, he writes, as interconnected escape capsules to enable their independence from the outside world. Now, I want to just pause for a moment and acknowledge that it may not seem to be the case that we're speaking here of democracy, right? And the space for democracy, which is the theme of our conversation today. But the intuition that I'm working with in this book is that these everyday environments and that everyday scale of relatedness has a great deal to do with either the vitality or the difficulty of our democratic culture. Take, for example, the fate of the front porch of our homes. An iconic feature of the American home, a porch was altogether absent from a new home in Moorhead that I'd visited and I talk about earlier in this chapter. As with many homes built in the United States since the Second World War. Emblem of an open society, as historian Michael Dolan has put it, the porch has long made a place for Americans to encounter and commune with neighbors and strangers alike. Take this sketch by James Agee of a casual summer's evening in Knoxville in 1915, a scene viewed from the rockers on a middle-class porch front. This is Agee writing about life in his neighborhood a century ago. People go by, things go by. A horse drawing a buggy breaks his hollow iron music on the asphalt. A loud auto, a quiet auto, people in pairs, not in a hurry, scuffling, switching their weight of estival body, talking casually, the taste hovering over them of vanilla, strawberry, pasteboard, and starched milk. As liminal spaces between the inside and outside of American homes, porches made social interchange possible even in the face of harsh realities like racial and class division. It was on a porch one evening in southern New York, for example, that household cook Marianne Cord, formerly enslaved, told Mark Twain the gripping story that would set him on the path to writing The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. But over the course of the 20th century, front porches slowly gave way to interior living rooms and backyard decks as places to gather. There were many reasons for this decline. With the development of air conditioning, families no longer had to bide their time waiting for the temperature to drop on summer days. The television could pick up from front porch storytellers and the spectacle of the street. With the explosion of mass-produced housing in the post-war era, builders cut costs by eliminating accessory spaces like porches and vestibules. There was also the crowning of the automobile as the chief means of transport and king of the roads, which lent noise and dust the experience of the porch, giving another reason to take shelter inside. As new residential roads and developments were laid out with vehicles rather than pedestrians in mind, the basic aperture of the American home shifted from the front door to the garage. It's not that the vestibule disappeared, Fargo builder Jason Ide noted when we met. It actually grew big enough for a car. Ide's family business, Ideco Homes, had built over 5,000 houses in Fargo over the course of nearly 70 years. The company was responsible for a new home that real estate agent Paul Krabenoft and I had visited in Moorhead. Like many of their houses, Ide explained, its design was informed by a commitment to utility and efficiency. Front porches were more of a ponytail idea, he said, appealing to professors and designers with a certain kind of vision, but ultimately costs that the market wouldn't support. In recent years, porches have made a bit of a comeback as typical features of new homes, in Fargo as elsewhere around the country. The impulse to retreat, however, continues to manifest in many structural features of the suburban home. I could see this in the new houses that I was shown as I circled, and I'm talking about a particular day that I was circling through the Fargo area with a real estate agent, all of which were constructed by another major local builder. With names like the Woods and Pine Lake Grove, both pseudonyms, these sprawling new developments evoke the bygone days of an open frontier, promising big lots with homes set at a distance from one another and good views of the landscape. Later, I asked the developer who started the company why such a layout would appeal to local homebuyers. People here don't want to be congested, he told me. I don't want to open my window and pass over some sugar by hand to the neighbor next door. So I want to stop here for a moment and just sort of underscore what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the ways in which our most basic experience of collective life at the threshold between our domestic interior spaces and the public life of the streets and communities in which we live has been transformed by basic changes in the architecture, layout, and design of our homes that magnify and intensify the division between insiders and outsiders, that rob us of the kind of potential embodied in liminal interstitial spaces like the front porch, which could, in fact, be understood as prototypical spaces of American democracy, right? Spaces like the Agora, but on a more individual, on a more local scale, that have had really important resonances in the collective life that people in this country have enjoyed, but have really fallen by the wayside in neighborhoods all around the country. I want to shift scale slightly, though, from the space of the home as such to how we think about the space of our communities at a larger scale. And I want to take you to another chapter of the book where I'm thinking about public space at the heart of a town in North Texas called Denton, which some of you may have been to. I don't know. It is a town that whose racial history I write about in this book as well. I write about the way in which ideas of the dominant white majority in this town in the early 20th century led to the wholesale expulsion of the Black community of Denton to its distant outskirts just about a century ago. And the many generations of anti-racist struggle that people in this community, people exiled in that manner, have had to wage, often in alliance with white allies and others who've had serious concerns about that racial history, and the ways in which that work of rallying together with a different vision of collective justice in mind has actually made important changes in the public life of this city. Denton now has its first Black mayor, someone that I interviewed for the book as well. But there's also important work that's also been done with regard to the town square at the very center of this small city. And I want to tell you a story about recent developments on this square that I hope will get once again at this larger theme of what it means to make space for democracy and the kinds of relationships with others we might sustain if we took the value of those spaces more seriously and thought about the kinds of social promise that they embody. For many decades, the most prominent symbol that consecrated Denton as white public space was the Confederate monument looming over the southern edge of the courthouse square at the heart of the town. Placed here by a local chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1918, the structure featured a granite archway supporting an impassive soldier made of stone, a young white man facing south, rifle in hand, and a knife and water canteen strapped to his waist. The archway columns describe the war's Southern martyrs as a song heard far in the future. Their examples reach a hand through all the years to meet and kindle generous purpose and mold it into acts as pure as theirs, or so it goes, on this monument. Below these words were a disused pair of drinking fountains built into the structure and etched with the years of the Civil War, 1861 and 1865. Denton's leading white women took the creation of the monument as a matter of civic duty in the early 20th century, holding plays, dinners, and benefits to finance its construction, even bailing paper and selling sandwiches. Let's just pause for a moment and think about this public space as public and yet segregated, right? Public and yet open only to some, public and yet welcome to certain members of that public and absolutely not to others. For Denton's Black residents, the Confederate monument at the courthouse square was something else altogether, a giant keep off the grass sign as former city council member Deb Armentor described it to me, a way of asserting the heart of the town as white residential property. As Katina Stone Butler, a Black singer and activist, put it, there were spiritual barriers that persisted around the courthouse square. Stone Butler had come to Denton from Memphis nearly 30 years prior to study music at the University of North Texas. Our conversation yielded deep insights into the history of the square as a stronghold of white supremacist ideals and an abiding symbol of an oppressive legacy. Our Black ancestors and elders passed down a legacy of survival, teaching us to navigate around these oppressive structures, Stone Butler told me, describing the square as a manifestation of a spiritual redlining that used architecture and invisible lines as a form of terror and gatekeeping to instill fear. This fear is so ingrained that younger generations of Black locals often avoid the square, she added. This adaptive response to trauma has been continuously passed down and reshaped through generations. Denton's Confederate monument was finally taken down in June of 2020 in response to the Black Lives Matter protests that summer led by Stone Butler and many others, but most especially thanks to many years of dedicated campaigning by civil rights activist Willie Hudspeth. For 21 years, Willie Hudspeth kept up a weekly public vigil at the monument on Sunday afternoons. He testified countless times to the Denton County Commissioner's Court, the political body responsible for the courthouse square. He did not typically argue for removal of the monument on these occasions, as though its racist legacy could simply be erased with such a gesture. Instead, Hudspeth maintained that the two water fountains at its base needed to be restored to service once again, so that anyone might drink from them regardless of race. Willie Hudspeth's forefathers had survived the horrors of slavery in West Texas. He grew up in Fort Worth and first came to Denton as a university student in 1971, after serving in the Air Force for several years in Vietnam. He was wearing an old camouflage jacket when we met for the first time in Denton in late 2017. Turn them back on, that's what I'm asking, he explained, as we talked about the monument and its fountains. Turn them on now so I can drink from them. You didn't let my ancestors drink, but let me. It'll be a proud day when we can all stand in line and drink from those fountains. Hudspeth spoke about his crusade to restore water to the fountains on the Confederate monument as a search for closure in the face of wounds that had lingered for decades. I can visualize it, he told me. I can see myself doing it with my 6 granddaughters in front of me. They'll drink, I'll drink, and then it'll be over. That freedom, now we can drink. He was imagining, I could see, a kind of homecoming in the city in the face of decades of Jim Crow segregation that he and so many others had endured, the possibility that Denton might yet become a place for the sustenance of Black life. As it happened, the taking down of the Confederate monument on the courthouse square a few years later did not unfold in such a spirit of collective caretaking, instead happening under cover of darkness, with no words of warning to Hudspeth and the many others who had waited so long for the moment. But Hudspeth accepted the monument's removal as a good and necessary thing. And a few months later, when Katina Stone Butler and other producers of the Black History for White People podcast interviewed him about his long struggle, he spoke again about the need for a collective healing. We all need to get together and work on some things together, he said. The podcasters reminded Hudspeth of the city's plans to name June 9th, the day that the Confederate monument was removed from the courthouse square, as Willie Hudspeth Day henceforth. How would you like to see that day celebrated or commemorated moving forward? One of the things that I've learned in this whole process is that we keep separating ourselves from each other, Hudspeth told Stone Butler and the other podcasters, reflecting on the long shadows of segregation. Get with another race and do something. If it's just going to the park, letting the kids play, and sitting there doing nothing, get with someone of a different race and just chill with them. That's how I want the day remembered. Against the backdrop of a racially segregated history with persistent and thorny legacies, something as simple as sharing space with racial others could stand out as a political act. And that's a lot of what this book is about ultimately. It's about the meaningfulness of finding those spaces to share with others unlike ourselves, of leaning into the social promise of spaces like public parks, libraries, trails, sidewalks, places where we can, in fact, share a life in common with people we don't know that well, with strangers, with neighbors, with others with whom, in whose company, we can imagine the possibility of actually sharing a collective space together that is composed of people of different backgrounds and experiences and all kinds of diversity, yet still, in fact, has that space for them to share that collective life. I want to share just one more small fragment from the conclusion of the book that actually takes us back to Baltimore and takes us back to the value or the necessity of that broader sense of communal caretaking, of mutual aid, of the kind of responsibility and solidarity we can show each other as a different vision of collective life in our country that still remains possible, a vision sustained by our common spaces, and what I would argue is a vision that is sustained not only by those spaces, but also sustains the kind of common sense we so desperately need in this country. For without those kinds of spaces and initiatives and ways for people to come together in public space together, we will ever remain fragmented and failing to understand what we need to understand about each other's lives. So just a couple paragraphs that take us back to Baltimore, and then we'll pause, and I'm glad to enter into some dialogue with folks who've joined. So, Baltimore. We are lucky to live on a walkable street near the Hopkins campus with a civic sensibility and a thriving front porch culture where people are likely to encounter and often nod and acknowledge others they don't know on a daily basis. But it's also the case that for so many of us here, the years of the pandemic turned our life farther outward toward the common streets, alleys, and trails of the neighborhood we shared. Space was held on the asphalt for daily walkers and occasional block parties. Birthdays and long weekends were celebrated out in the open on front lawns and porches. Halloween, which just happened again, brought neighbors together to plan one-way trick-or-treating routes and strategies to deliver candy from a distance. New forms of mutual aid, assistance with groceries, community initiatives in public health, collaborative modes of parenting took shape in our neighborhood of Wyman Park, as with so many other places during the early months of the pandemic. But there were also more radical initiatives elsewhere in the city that transformed the spatial coordinates of home and belonging, like the Be More Community Fridge, established in the fall of 2021 and managed month by month by a dedicated team of volunteers and donors. This is an image of that fridge, which still exists near in the Station North area, and it represents to me the value of a commitment to making provisions available in the public space that people share in a city, rather than solely for oneself and one's own within the space of one's own home. The fridge has a place in a local ecosystem of public resources, lodged in an alleyway off North Avenue, beside Community Garden, Hidden Harvest, and drawing electricity from Blue Light Junction, an adjacent community dye garden and educational facility. Painted vibrantly with an image of okra and purple corn at first, later a goldfinch munching on sunflower seeds, the fridge is stocked fresh fruit and vegetables, bread, snacks, and many other groceries. All of these goods were free for the taking, shared publicly with a take what you need and give what you can philosophy. Like other such resources established around the country, the Be More Community Fridge was created to address the rampant food insecurity in American cities, exacerbated by the pandemic and affecting Black and Brown communities disproportionately. But as a founder of the effort, former Johns Hopkins University student Clara Leverins noted, the outdoor resource also served as a means of deepening social relationships at a moment of intense isolation. The fridge has been a real connector, she observed. Christina Calhoun, another core organizer, suggested that at the end of the day, everyone understands sharing a meal, having a first aid cabinet, having a paper goods cabinet, that feeling of safety. It is striking that in meeting that need for safety, these organizers look beyond the domestic sphere, instead creating a shared space of belonging that turned the line between home and world inside out. And that's exactly what's at stake, I would argue, just to wrap all this up. That's exactly what's at stake in this book and exactly what's at stake in this moment in our country. Does our well-being, does our safety, does our security depend entirely on closing us off, closing ourselves off, walling ourselves off, on taking care of our own and ourselves, potentially at the expense of others? Or are there, in fact, these ways in which we can lean into our public space, our collective space, take better care of each other in these shared spaces, and thereby build other kinds of foundations for the healthy democracy that we do need and do cherish and do need to protect and sustain in this country. So thank you so much for the chance to share some passages and reflections and ideas from this book of mine. And I look forward to entering into conversation in the time that we have left.
I I'm so grateful, and if we were in a not in a virtual space, we would all give a round of applause for your sharing your brilliance and your research. And we have questions coming in from the audience, and I encourage folks to keep putting those in the chat on a range of topics. Um, and I wanted to start around this idea of the methodology of what you experienced, and you talk to people all across the country, and you gave different examples in restaurants and neighborhoods, and it reminds me of we brought in the political empathy lab out of with our partners at University of Pennsylvania Padia. They came in and spoke about this at the festival after the election in last year. They went all across before and after the election, the presidential. They went all across Pennsylvania just to talk to people, and there's an intentionality around that. Like you're like it is your job to like you chose a project, but there's an intentionality around that. So I'm curious both like, what was surprising to you about those conversations where like were people more or less willing to engage in these conversations, and what can we learn from that? I mean, I think, I'll speak for myself. Like I get stuck in my routines very quickly, and I go to the same grocery store, the same, office to home to gym to grocery store, and it's tricky sometimes to get out of the bubble that you mentioned Obama spoke to. And I guess I'd add to that, there's this cultural piece. So we had, trick-or-treating was a couple days ago, last week. And it was in Baltimore. There was a neighborhood not far from mine. They had over 1,000 trick-or-treaters came by. This is huge cultural, like this is cultural understanding that here's a neighborhood that kids from all across the city come to and trick or treat. And it's this like joyful fun, people talking, laughing. And I was like, oh man, could we do this once a month to turn, the definition of home inside out and to reinvigorate what it means to be on your front stoop? And like, but there's a shared cultural understanding. So that was a lot there. But how did you think about those conversations, and how can we be thinking about them in our everyday life?
I really appreciate the spirit of those questions and reflections. And so thank you so much for that. I would say, just to begin, that one of the catchphrases that we use when we think about what this business of anthropology is that it's an endeavor to render the strange familiar and the familiar strange. That is to say, we want to develop some familiarity with what may seem very strange and foreign to us, but can in fact be understood. On the other hand, we want to look at what we take for granted as familiar and normal from a different eye. We want to see it through the eyes of strangers and try through that exercise to imagine whether our normal life could in fact happen a different way. Halloween, I think, is a beautiful example of that, where the normality of everyday life in our neighborhoods gets upended by all the costumes that people come by in and all of that intense sociality that can unfold over a couple of hours. We had somewhere between 200 and 300 kids at our door, actually, on our porch, sort of trick-or-treating, just a few days ago. We live in one of those neighborhoods, and it's extraordinary. Halloween is a ritual. It's a ritual occasion. It's a ritual occasion where people feel comfortable doing that. But there are other rituals that we might imagine as other ways of sustaining that spirit. The book takes neighborliness really seriously. The book takes neighborly relations really seriously, because I think the everyday gestures of nodding at people that you may not know, and yet you find that you're sharing a space and you have to acknowledge them somehow, right? Or saying a hello to people who you cross on sidewalks or on trails or other spaces when people are out of their vehicles and actually on foot in on our roads and trails and so on. These rituals also matter. These more everyday gestures also matter. And we rely on that kind of give and take when we do this work as anthropologists. We rely on the hope that social life, regardless of how atomized and isolated and suspicious so many things may have become, still carries with it that potential to meet people that you don't know with some degree of respect and some sense of responsibility to engage. So as anthropologists, we depend on the evincing of those qualities among people we talk to, and I think that books like this are written with the hope that if we take those interchanges more seriously, we can find a way to build them back into the texture of our lives.
But there's something in everyday small actions that become habit, become culture,
Absolutely, but
that
it
we
isn't.
have a role in that.
We have a role in that, but our institutions also have a role in that. I think that's why this theme of holding that space for democracy is so important, because our institutions need to play a role as well. It isn't enough just for us to aspire to these habits of relation. We need the kinds of spaces in which to do that. We need investments in the kind of civic collective infrastructure that would sustain that fabric of interconnection. We couldn't have hundreds of kids coming down our street trick-or-treating on a night like Halloween unless we had sidewalks, unless we had the kinds of civic investments that made that something that was safe and comfortable for people to do. Those investments also matter in addition to the habits.
So that, so I'm hearing a call for a monthly trick-or-treating that we can start here in Baltimore, or we'll just, you and I can start that tradition of opening up all of our houses monthly. But I think part of what you're saying too is around a collective agreement, or at least an agreement through the people who made the policies to have sidewalks and a safe neighborhood at that time of day that made that activity possible. And the goal of an anthropologist or a researcher around understanding, which is different than the goal of um, a politician or a or members of my family or sometimes myself to be right. And so how are you thinking about nesting this work in a broader political context of polarization of it's hard as much as we want to understand and empathize, there's also conversations, very live, it's election day, very live conversations of right or wrong. Um, so how do you contend with that when with your anthropologist hat on and then taking your anthropologist hat off and what you're seeing across the
Yeah,
country and around the world?
yeah. Look, the polarization is real. And there's no denying it. And there's no denying that feelings are very strong. And honestly, with good reason. There are a lot of things that people have very good reasons to be upset about, concerned about, nervous about, anxious about. All of those things are there and they're real and they have to be contended with. The argument that I'm making in this book is that we need to understand polarization not simply as a matter of identity or ideology, but instead as a kind of feature of what our lives have become in this country. It's one thing to talk about polarization in terms of red and blue, in terms of party affiliation, in terms of personal ethnic or racial identity or personal background, but there is a polarization at stake in the divide between the inside and outside of our homes, between the inside and outside of our vehicles, between my space and someone else's space. The less we have space in common, the less we have space to share share, the less we have occasions to actually find common ground and develop shared forms of understanding, the more polarized everything will of necessity become. So this book is an attempt to encourage us to think about this problem of polarization in infrastructural terms rather than simply as a matter of my ideas as opposed to someone else's ideas. How did that gap between us grow to that magnitude and scale? When one is confronting this, though, and when one is seeking to try to make sense of that or to do this work as an anthropologist, it does require a suspension of judgment. It requires a willingness to listen, often a difficult listening when the ideas that you're taking in are ideas that you disagree with fundamentally, ideas that strike against the heart of what you take seriously as necessary or as true about the world. I had to suspend my own judgments in order to be able to try to understand some of these sharply polarized situations from the vantage point of others whose ideas and commitments were very different from my own. But I think that there's a value to that. The value to that isn't simply about somehow trying to come to agreement, somehow trying to find the sort of meeting in the middle. That can be possible, and there are coalitions to be formed, and there are compromises to be made, and there are new forms of political possibility to be sketched where people can find their way beyond their differences and to try to figure out what else can be done with a political situation as vexing as ours. But sometimes it can also just be enough, I would say, to try to understand why the divides are as deep as they are, why the differences are as stark as they are. And even if you're not necessarily going to come to agreement, at least to have some understanding of the foundations, some better understanding of the foundations from which someone else's very different position on the world is articulated, why it feels so meaningful to them, why it feels like that's the best interpretation of what is real and necessary. That can also help, I think, if not in the immediate, then at least in the long run. Because eventually we are going to have to find a way of living with each other. There's no way around it. We share a planet.
We thank you for sharing. We do. And even as you said that, I was filled with hope and fear of having these types of conversations. And we have time for just about one more question. It goes so quickly. There's a lot of questions in the chat around solutions and challenges. Like what about AI? What about zoning? What about hostile architecture? Could you share in a minute or two, since we're running out of time, as you do this work? And again, you started this work a few election cycles ago. It's election day today. What are you hopeful for, and what are some of the solutions that we should be thinking about as individuals and collectively? A softball.
I think this is actually a really interesting election cycle to ponder that particular question with, because it's a local election, a really meaningful local election in many places around the country, but it is not a national presidential election in the same way. It's a reminder, in other words, of the fact that our polities are multiple, they're nested. There are things happening at different scales simultaneously, and moments of stark impossibility at certain scales may be matched side by side at the same time with other forms of emergent possibility at other scales. A lot of the more hopeful narrative and storytelling in the book. You got some glimpse of it from one of those stories, I hope, from Denton, Texas. A lot of that more hopeful thinking in the book draws on what I've learned from activists for social justice of different kinds, from activists for environmental justice, for racial justice, for gender justice, for clean water, for safe roads, people working at smaller scales to make life more habitable in collective terms. So much in our country conspires to lead us to believe that our safety, security, and well-being are best secured by ourselves, for ourselves as individuals. And yet, I would say the work of these organizers in many parts of the country, including right here in Baltimore, right? Folks that have also had the privilege of working with, in some ways, through our Ecological Design Collective and other ways, right? The work of these folks also reminds us that there's meaningful work to be done at other scales, and that these experiments represent not only a commitment to actually taking seriously the idea that our well-being is ultimately bound up with the well-being of others, but also thereby, through that understanding of our interconnection, giving a deeper and more sustainable texture to the fabric of our democratic culture and our democratic life, because that fabric of democracy requires that faith in what we can do in the company of others, especially in the company of others who we may not know that well, who we may not always agree with, who may not always have the same ideas that we do, and yet are the folks with which we must necessarily build out the framework of that collective life. So I think that there's a lot to learn from folks involved in that work. I draw a great deal of inspiration from that work. And I would just encourage people who feel, sort of more troubled and frustrated about where things are to maybe just look as widely as they can at the range of things that are happening, and to think about the different kinds of openings they might have access to in their different civic spaces, and to see where participation in those different forms of civic life may ultimately take them.
This is so timely and appreciated. So thank you for your time today. And I'm thinking about, I'm new to Johns Hopkins, and even since I've been here, we've opened the Hopkins Bloomberg Center, the Student Center on the Homewood campus. I've gotten to co-host some events at the Hopkins Bloomberg Center in DC, and we're opening the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Agora building here. So Johns Hopkins is playing really, really important and interesting roles in this for student life, but also in relationship with the the Baltimore community and the DC community. So to folks on the call and for folks listening in, definitely check out those events and there's resources from the SNF Agora Institute around civic spaces and third spaces. And of course, reading Professor Pandian's book. I want to thank everyone for coming together to co-creating this civic space, this third
And
space together.
and if I may just jump in for
Yeah.
just a minute, Mary, can we also just remind folks, if they're interested, that at the Bloomberg Center of Hopkins in DC, I'll actually be talking about this book on November 17th with Hari Han, the wonderful director of the Agora Institute and recent MacArthur Fellow. So
Yes,
that's another way to remain connected with this conversation.
absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll be sure to share that out with folks after the call as well. We're looking forward to that. I can't wait to come to that one. The other upcoming events I'll flag is on November 19th, again here in a virtual space. We're co-hosting an event with the Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, on democratic resilience in the face of global disruption. And we will share that information in the chat as well. Lots of other great events coming up. We'll post the SNF Agora and hopkins@hom.jhu.edu events links in the chat. And we'd also greatly appreciate your feedback on this event and your ideas to put together upcoming events as well. So we'll put that form in the survey and share it out over email. Again, your feedback and your participation is so valued. We're so grateful to everybody who joined today, to Professor Pandian, to Hopkins at Home, to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making today possible, and the great recommendations for how we can create a better future together.
Thank you so much for hosting and for the chance to share some of this work with you all. I really do appreciate this opportunity.
Wonderful.